I think this is a really exciting and important time to be talking about journalists and their sources. We've obviously had, in Northern Ireland, we've recently had 2 journalists arrested and their materials seized by police in an effort to kind of find the leak of a very much overwhelmingly in the public interest investigation. In Australia, we've had raids on ABC's offices after they published a report about the Australian Special Forces role in Afghanistan. And these rightly have been raised. This has resulted in concerns about press freedom, and kind of at the heart of that is the journalists' responsibility in protecting their sources. And Shiv's book is a fascinating and I think really honest look into the role of a journalist and protecting sources, building relationships with sources, and also a journalist's kind of relationship with the authorities, particularly in an era of a heightened terrorist threat. So yeah, just to start at the beginning, Shiv, who is the messenger and who is the subject of Shiv's book here, which just happens to be lying here, if any of you would like to buy a copy. Who is the messenger and how did he become a source?
Thanks, Jane. So yes, no, really do buy a copy. The publisher's like, we need to sell these. We printed up 2,000 and you're not doing so well, Shiv. This is actually his face, which the graphic designer did an excellent job on it. And in a sense, he ended up being a man with a whole load of identities, but the he is a guy called Hassan Butt. And I met him in the aftermath of the July 7th bombing. So I was asked by the BBC to do a drama documentary. And drama documentaries are also weird things to be researchers for, because you're coming from the factual side, and yet you're supplying information for something that is a sort of drama, and lots of bits are sort of fictionalized. So there's this crossover between truth and fiction. And anyway, as part of that, my job was primarily to go up to Beeston in Leeds, and try and speak to the families, the 3 families that were up there of the July 7th bombers, and extract from them kind of what had happened, and get the colour and the detail of life. Anyway, we didn't progress very far at that point with them, sort of banging my head against a brick wall when it came to sort of this wall of silence, which I'm sure we can come on to talking about. But one person who was ready and willing to speak was Hassan Butt. And he was at that time a very flamboyant sort of character, known for doing various interviews saying, look, jihadists are going to come back from Afghanistan and they're going to, there's going to be death on the streets of Britain. I myself, sort of a year later, he said, I myself want to be a suicide bomber. So he'd given all these sort of interviews, and the Sun had, at that point, I think, rated him as the top 5 most hated jihadists in Britain, which is the kind of moniker that you really want on your wall there. If you're going to be a jihadist, the Sun's got to hate you and got to put you in the top 5. So I went along to visit him in that state with an eye to just sort of having a conversation about, what is it like to be a jihadist? What do you eat for breakfast? What do you wear? Like, how do you, shower and stuff? And like, what's your life like? What's the minute color details? That's what the drama doc people wanted from me. And I think he found that quite peculiar. So I met him then in 2006. A few months later, and I'll end my rambling introduction here. A few months later, he then says, he just emails out of the blue. And he says, Shiv, I've been having doubts about my ideological leanings. I'm not sure really what to do with my life, but I think I've left what he described as the British Jihadi network. So, do you have any ideas? And I said, yes, I think I sort of talked to other people who'd left these kinds of networks before. And they'd come out and written stuff, and that really helped expose what those groups were about, but also helped them, sort of a cathartic process in a sense. So I said, you should write. Why don't you write a book? He said, I don't know how to write a book. I said, okay, well, I guess I can help you, and I'll be your ghostwriter. And that turned out to be possibly the worst mistake I ever made in my life, which you can read about in this book, and you can buy outside. No, yeah.
You mentioned there kind of the wall of silence that you initially came up against, and I kind of know from my personal experience reporting on radicalisation that it can be incredibly difficult to get people from deprived areas, and particularly kind of the Muslim community, to trust journalists. You know, these are people who are often demonised by parts of the press, they've been mistreated by the authorities, and that's before you even get into kind of the world of terrorism. So I'm just curious, kind of, how did you go about trying to gain the trust not only of kind of Hassan Butt, but other people in jihadi circles who you've interviewed through your career?
Well, I think, as you know, we were discussing sort of outside, you have to be incredibly persistent. That just comes with the turf, right? So I did, in fact, get the brother of Mohammed Sadiq Khan to talk to me. No one knew he had a brother. In fact, he had two brothers.
You should tell the taxi story, because I love the taxi story.
Yes, all right. So no one knew he had a brother, or in fact, two brothers. And so it was a remarkable discovery. And people forget, I think, maybe it's just a journalist thing, or maybe it's a wider community thing. It's like how well integrated ethnic minority communities often are with each other and not with the rest of society. So there's two things. We often focus on that second part. You're like, oh, this integration thing is not working very well. But within themselves, they are very well integrated. And that's not an outright good thing, because it turns out if you want to extract information or talk to people, or if you want people to talk to you, they're scared, because they know that as soon as they do that, other people in the community start asking them questions. Why are you talking to a journalist? What are you saying? Who are you bad-mouthing, right? This is going to get us in trouble. And of course, if you're doing something like trying to figure out why 3 people from basically a couple of streets have gone and killed 52 other people in London, you need answers. You can't just let that lie and go, oh, well, you know, it's all sensitive there. You have to be persistent. You have to say, well, look, hang on, you've got a moral responsibility to talk. And this community in Beeston was being controlled by community elders. So we had to talk to people at the dead of night, way off on the other side of Leeds, because, you know, otherwise they were just like, I'm too scared to talk to you otherwise. And you're like, why? Like, I don't, you know, and it's like, well, my life will be ruined. I will be ostracized from the people I've grown up with for the rest of my life. So eventually, through this network and through the taxi network, which is a great information sort of repository, because they all gossip, but they all know each other. But you also have to protect people against being spotted by taxi drivers, which is like, they're everywhere, right? I discovered Mohammed Sadiq Khan's brother. His name was Gultasab, and so I figured out bit by bit by trading up information. Oh, okay, he does the night shift in the station at Leeds. Okay, this is his cab number. Okay, you know, and I just waited there over several nights, and eventually he turned up. I got in his cab, and I said, "Can you take me to Bradford?" Because that was like the longest journey I knew from Central Leeds Station. About 20 minutes. And he said, okay. And I actually reread my notes recently and had the whole conversation listed out. So we chatted. I told him I was a journalist, but I didn't tell him I knew who he was, till we got to this petrol station in Beeston. And, in Bradford. And I said to him, I know who you are. And he just froze. And I thought, oh God, he's gonna throw me out of his cab. He's kind of a biggish guy, like he's gonna beat me up, or he's just gonna get incredibly angry at me, or, I mean, you know, it's the middle of the night. It's 2 o'clock in the morning in a petrol station. And he said, okay. And I said, all right, so can we talk? I said, no, I'm not comfortable with this. And slowly by slowly, we sort of formulated this relationship where I would sit in his cab at night, pretending to him, even though he knew what I was about, just like a regular customer, get in at 2 in the morning, sit in his cab, and be able to confirm facts with him. So whatever we learned, he would confirm and say, yes, that's right, no, that's wrong. But he would never give anything away. And that's how we worked for about 9 months.
And that can be I've found as well, an incredibly useful way for not only getting information that kind of confirm or deny if a source is too nervous to kind of provide information. Often, like Shiv's found, they will be willing to say, yes, that's right, no, that's not. And eventually, often I found in kind of reporting on an ISIS story myself, on a Russia assassinations investigation, you build up the relationship slowly where actually then they will start passing you information because they've trusted you enough to let you in halfway. And then sometimes you can get to that level of relationship. But it's often a really good way in if someone's saying, no, I'm not going to tell you anything.
Well, it's the other thing that to realise on this particular dynamic was that this guy had lost. So obviously there was massive opprobrium attached to what his brother did. So he had to deal with that. But he'd also lost a brother, right? His brother had committed suicide by killing other people. And so he was going through a huge trauma. But in those moments, you want to know stuff. So he wanted to know. He wanted to know as much as I did what had happened. And that was the way in, right? And actually, and you'll know from terrorism, when people go off and get killed in foreign places, the first thing the family, the main driver for the family is they want to know what happened to their child, right? And that's, and this is the thing, you can use that, and you have to be incredibly sensitive and ethical about how you use that to say, okay, look, I can try and help. So we're on the same journey, actually. I want to know, you want to know. The problem is that the more I expose it, it makes your life much harder. That's you got to. I tended by the end of my years of doing this door knocking and, look, your son's died in Syria. Can we talk? I realized that I had to really be forthright. I said, look, by talking to me, this is going to make your life harder. And that actually worked a lot better than trying to hide that. It was difficult to do that kind of stuff,
that's
as you know.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating to hear that it also, it works for you as well.
We should form a little trauma club.
Trauma club, yeah.
Yeah.
And once you'd kind of got that introduction to Hassan and you'd kind of built that relationship or developed that relationship, how did you end up ghostwriting his book, Your Worst Mistake Ever?
Yeah. So, I mean, actually, that part of it was pretty easy. He was a very loquacious guy, having, given many media interviews over the years, and he had this great facility. He's very charming and a pretty funny guy, and it was, it's just fascinating speaking to someone who would speak like you in that sense, right? Just almost as eloquent and intelligent.
That's good.
Yeah. Meaning that you are more eloquent than him, just to be precise. And he had the same kind of cultural background, and so it wasn't like speaking to someone from Syria who'd come over to Britain and said, "Oh yes, I'm trying to radicalize the youth." This is someone who was, in a sense, a cultural peer. So we got on in that way, almost famously. Which is also weird. You're like, oh, but wait, he's a sort of a source and I'm his ghostwriter and we should have an arm's length relationship. But sometimes you have to get close to people for them to be able to tell you stuff, but then you can't help being close to them in that process. It's very hard to be a journalist, right, in that sense, and go, no, I have to step back from this personal relationship. So, and you do that for long enough and you become friends with your source, which is a huge mistake. So, we spent months and months doing these interviews and going back and forth over the writing. And that came to a close when the Greater Manchester Police showed up on my door.
And just before we get to that point, because that is a very dramatic story that you're all also going to love, I'm curious about kind of the balancing the relationship with the source. You said you became friends in the end. Looking back today, how important do you think it is to keep that divide between friendship and kind of a strictly professional journalistic relationship with a source while also trying to get close enough to them that they trust you and give you information?
I've trained investigative journalists before, and I have, on my lesson on sources, I have basically one slide, which says, it's like, it would be plastered all over this at this point if I had it right now, which is, don't be friends with your source. And I just keep coming back to that again and again and again, because it's the ruin of many, I think, a story. Or many a journalist. And I certainly fell into that. Because you lose your cynicism, you lose your ability to genuinely question the facts before you. So it's incredibly dangerous things to do. And as I said, it's very dependent upon that dynamic. Like, if I want you, let's say, as a source to sort of start confessing and trusting me, I have to open up. And that it's faking a friendship, right? And we've all seen those, those things exposed when, journalist emails, private emails to sources sort of get exposed, and you're like, oh, that's uncomfortable, right? Because they seem really friendly, and actually they stabbed them in the back, right? Because they were doing their job. Yeah. But how you do that is obviously, it's incredibly difficult. You have to, learning to be honest and not make false promises in those moments. That's the key, I think.
Yeah, and I think particularly in investigative journalism, it's like, journalism as a whole is a 9-to-5 job, but investigative journalism in particular is kind of developing those relationship sources where you might go for dinner after work or a drink or something, or see them on a weekend. And I think that sometimes can give a source an impression that you are more of a friend.
Right, and you're also their protector sometimes, right? Where, their livelihood, their jobs are on the line because of what they're telling you. And you know that it's good for you. They're not getting paid for that, right? But they could lose everything. And so you also feel this sort of paternalistic relationship towards them. And so you want to make them feel good about who you are, that you're not a bad person. And it's all deeply psychological stuff, right? Which you have to be fully aware of. And I think only as I've got much older have I been able to express that to a source and say, look, this is what's going to happen to you. This is what's going on. And this is going to be the dynamic between us, and it's going to be really hard. And what you need to do is keep checking in with me and make sure you're all right with this next story or with this next piece of information coming out. And are you sure X, Y, and Z, right? Like, again, I've had a source for 6 months giving me a whole series of leaks from at the time, sort of the DWP's sort of all their plans for austerity. This is back in 2012, 2013. And at the end of that process, the Ian Duncan Smith hired someone from an ex-MI5 agent to investigate who my source was. And I was like, we really have to stop now.
This was on the DWP story? I thought this was on the terrorism story.
No. They were so serious about finding who my source or sources were that, they were, it's recording it now, so I've got to be careful, that they hired, and it was published in the Times. They didn't ring me up and tell me that that's what they were doing, but I think it came out in the Times, that they'd hired this guy to find out, ex-MI5 guy, to find out who my source was. And I was like, I had a serious conversation with my editor. We've got to stop. The source was willing to carry on. And like, no, this has got too far. And it's a good way of sort of closing stuff down, but you also had to have that conversation with this person, or several people, that this had to stop.
That's incredible to me, even as an investigative journalist, that you were being followed for a story about austerity and government policy rather than terrorism or national security, which I would expect it a bit more. Yeah. But kind of on that note, like terrorism... I don't know if I was being followed, but they'd employed this person to monitor you.
Well, yeah, or to find the source of the leak. So I don't know what that entailed at the end. And
I think it's even trickier, right, on terrorism as a beat. That is one of the trickiest beats for a journalist to cover while still protecting their sources. When you were doing this story and kind of building a relationship and communicating with Hassan Butt, how did you manage the conflict between wanting to be a diligent journalist and keeping notes and recordings of everything versus making sure there wasn't an electronic trail or anything that could expose your source?
So my first instinct is to always record everything. It comes from perhaps also a lack of confidence. As I become more confident, maybe I think, okay, look, I can trust my own memory to serve me well. But also you're desperately worried that when the stakes are raised when you're just doing investigative journalism, because you can get sued and the costs can be quite high compared to regular daily reporting. So you want to record everything. You're like, you said this is what you said. And I said this in response. And actually living in an age where everything does get sort of naturally recorded anyway, it kind of helps. But then there's the inverse of that, which is that the more you record, the easier it is to find the trail. And you're like, he's like desperately trying to remember like old analog ways of doing things, like they're just not traceable. Like send something in the post. Like, does that still work? Like, can we remember how to do that anymore?
I'd show a BuzzFeed journalist how to put a stamp where a stamp goes in a letter once. Seriously.
Right.
Yeah. Much younger.
And it's desperately inconvenient, right? You're like, this is going to take days, and you could get it to me in a minute, right? And you're like, but in order to protect you, let's just take the inconvenient route, or, I'll drive up and we'll do this in the dead of night.
Were the kind of tools you used? I don't know, kind of Signal I don't think was around really back then,
No.
maybe Telegram, or was it all kind of all in person as much
Really,
as
no,
possible?
at that point in sort of, even between 2011 and post-Snowden, you're like, what can I trust anyway, right? Signal I felt was trustable, but then, your source has to also know how to use these things, right? So it's actually difficult. So, but it turns out for this, I recorded everything because he was going to be known, right? So I was ghostwriting his autobiography, and his name was going to be on it. So I wasn't protecting him in that way. He wasn't going to be secret, anonymous, or pseudonymous even. And in that sense, I kept absolutely everything, which turns out to be a good thing, because it allowed me to write this book, but then also use the audio material for a podcast. Who knew that was going to be a thing 14 years after I did those interviews? So.
Let's come to the police next, because that's kind of tied in. In your book and just now, you kind of mentioned the police turning up on your door and asking about your book. Kind of, what happened, and how did it feel like to have the police turn up on your door like that?
So I was finishing the manuscript for this original book, which is called Leaving Al-Qaeda. So this was the book where I was ghostwriting for Hassan Butt, and it's just like, it's his book, and it was going to be a big deal, and it was the first book of its kind. Like, here's a repentant jihadist. He's left this network. And I was late with handing this in. I mean, as you said, all authors are late. I'm like, yeah, I thought that too, but the publishers are really upset about this. And Amazon, the Amazon listing was still that it was going to come out basically in March of that week. And so the Greater Manchester Police, 3 officers show up at my door, and it's like 10 to 8 in the morning. I'm, being a freelance journalist, still in my boxer shorts. And so this is awkward. And they say, I thought it was something to do with my car. Like, my car, it's always getting into scrapes. Like, wherever I parked it, people would hit it for some reason. So I'd already had visits from the police officers, like local police officers going, sorry, sir, your car is being totaled again. I'm like, why?
They were wishing that was it.
Yeah. Well, then they said, so why are you here? And they said, we've driven down from Manchester. I was like, oh, this is bad. Because it's really early in the morning. You must have left at 3 to get here. And we're here to talk to you about a book that you're writing. And I thought, where do we live? Like, I thought we lived in the United Kingdom where we had freedom. Like, what are you talking to me about? A book that I'm writing? You're police officers. Why is this a criminal matter? I started like internally freaking out whilst also still in a state of semi-undress. So I said, okay. I said, can we come in? I said, no, you cannot. But you can go and have breakfast around the corner while I go get dressed. So I recommended them this lovely, we lived in Golders Green at the time, this lovely Israeli cafe where they made wonderful scrambled eggs and salad, and it was great. And so they were like, oh, great, yeah, we are hungry. So they go off and have breakfast whilst I rapidly get dressed, phone Martin Bright, formerly of at the New Statesman at that time, but he'd been through a source protection case with MI5 and David Shayler, if I'm not mistaken. I was like, Martin, what should I do? He's like, yeah, okay, this is what you need to do. You need to phone these lawyers and put your stuff in a bag and get it out of the house. I was like, great. So I put my tapes and all my notes in a bag, and the police are still having breakfast at this point. And I give it to my best friend. I'm like, go, take this to Paris. He's like, okay. So he, 4 hours later, it's on the Eurostar to my friend in Paris, and they come in and they serve me this production order. And they say, we want all of your notes. I'm thinking, they're on the way to Paris now. You missed it, but you got a good breakfast instead. Turns out the lawyers were like, that's not how that works, Shiv. Get them back. Sounded so good.
It's a good story.
Yeah. People were saying, why doesn't that work? Anyway, so, and they said, if you don't hand over all of your notes for leaving Al-Qaeda at the time it was called, they said, we think Hassan Barr is still a terrorist. So I was like, that obviously made me distrust my source. I was like, oh, this is awkward. And he'd already come out and said, he'd done this publicly, and also to the Home Office terrorism minister. He'd said, look, this is who I was. This is what I'd done in Pakistan. I'd been involved in some fairly serious terrorism incidences. But now I want to, convert people out of the network. And obviously you need someone who's genuine, who's, in a sense, been part of that network to have some credibility, right? To bring people out. So it'd be, I think people at the time were writing op-eds going, this is insane. Why are the Greater Manchester Police trying to shut this guy down? Isn't that exactly what we need? Mm. So I thought, okay, well, they've said that, fine, all right, they have their suspicions. But they also wanted all of my notes.
Not just related
to this book, but everything I'd ever done on terrorism over the years. And that's the thing I couldn't, yes, the person who said, what? That was my response too. I couldn't stand for that. And actually they gave that same production order to other people, including at the BBC, and they were outraged. So we ended up going to the Court of Appeal. We started off in Manchester Crown Court, and the judge kicked it up. And thankfully, and this is the thing to remember as journalists, please, please, please join the NUJ. Hands up, who's a member? Good, nice. All the people who didn't put their hands up, join the NUJ. Because without their help, I would have been utterly bankrupted, and you might not care about me, but you would have cared about case law, and that case law would have been written, which is why they, in the end, supported me, and the Sunday Times supported me. Writing that case law. So what they were using was the Terrorism Act at the time, the newly minted 2005 Terrorism Act, which had much greater powers than the whole PACE agenda. And because no one had been brought in under that, no one had been taken through the courts, no journalists had been taken through the courts, this was a real moment to test where the law stood. And if that had gone against me in a major way, or gone against the journalist, whoever that had been, it was me, then everyone here we'd be living in a different environment right now, a much more hostile one perhaps. So join the NUJ. That was my plug for the NUJ.
I appreciate that as well. And when the police kind of turned up on your door and you started, and they kind of made their case that this guy was still a jihadi, was this the first time you'd started to question or doubt your source?
Yes. Well, there had been moments before. I knew that Hassan had exaggerated things before. And in moments of exuberance, he might have fudged figures and gone, I spoke to, I gave this talk in front of 100 people. And, in my head I was thinking, there's probably 30 people there. But, it's fine, it's forgivable stuff. And lots of the stories had been rehearsed in the sense that they'd been told to friends. So sort of, comedic stories or stories with a funny sort of ending and a la Four Lions, basically. Like, we tried to go to a terrorist training camp in the Lake District and we used sticks for guns and then we froze to death and then, kind of thing. And we all had to come home. Ha, ha, ha. Hilarious. So anyway, so you tell those sort of stories, and I was like, okay, fine, I get that. But no, I think I trusted him, generally speaking, up to that point. There had been one incident we probably don't want to go into, but yeah. But obviously, when the police come and they say, look, here's a statement from this person, that person, here's our suspicions, and now we're taking you to court. I rang him, is what I did. I said, do you want me to protect you? Because you don't have to, as a source, I don't have to protect you if you don't want me to, because people know your name. They're going to know your name already. You're already well known. He said, yes, I do. And I kind of didn't want that obligation placed on me at that moment. I already knew I had to fight for the other sources who had already asked me for that, and I knew I had to protect. But I thought I could maybe negotiate that was possible with the police and say, okay, look, not this stuff, but this stuff, fine. But he asked me, he said, you've got to protect me, but also for all the other people that we've talked about on those tapes who weren't going to go in the book. So I had to take that obligation seriously.
And were there kind of any points, like while you were kind of developing your relationship with him, where you kind of looked at ways to verify what he was telling you, or perhaps kind of looking back now, you would have looked at trying to verify?
Well, it's the thing. I mean, there'd always been rumors about this guy. Is he the real deal? You always wonder, who am I speaking to? Am I speaking to a genuine person? Like, this person's giving me information. Do they actually work for this, organization? Are they part of this network? Are they, how can I verify that who I know I'm speaking to is the person I'm speaking to? Like, this is a classic set of questions, obviously. And what was said about him, he'd already, at one point, Alistair Campbell, or under his name as the sort of, Prime Minister's press spokesperson, had said that he was a fantasist, which is an interesting signal, because he had the right, his best friend was later to be convicted as a member of Al-Qaeda. His other best friend was a supergrass who'd put 17 people behind bars. He was giving interviews from Pakistan at the time of sort of post 9/11 with a whole load of, you can spot the people in the background. You're like, oh, they ended up dead. They ended up in prison, dead, right? You're like, oh, and why is he there otherwise?
His network was very real and
right.
powerful.
And so he wasn't spinning this yarn. So we knew who he was in that sense. But what was his game? Why speak? The question, right? That was always what came up. Why talk to journalists? This is weird. Like, most jihadists who are the real deal sit and plan, don't they? And plot. And the last thing they want is a bunch of journalists asking them a whole lot of questions. But you think, okay, well, look, it's also in their interest to have these sort of brash media spokespeople, It turned out, as you know, half of ISIS was their propaganda, right? So...
And during the course of kind of the police investigation, as I understand it, there was some police interview with Hassan Butt where he basically said he was a fantasist and that he'd been lying to you, and he was quite gleeful in how he'd misled you. Was there ever any point where you thought, my sources betrayed me, it's time, now, given the public interest of ongoing terrorism investigations, it's time to turn over my source? Or did that never cross your mind?
God, I wanted to do that. God, I wanted to kill him. So the day before the Court of Appeal hearing, in front of 3 very senior judges, with the support of the NUJ, the Sunday Times, PEN, half a dozen other organizations, a whole load of journalists are in there anyway, reporting on me as a journalist. That's awkward. And I'm 27 at the time, so I'm naive, fresh, and now in the Court of Appeal, and they're all courts of justice.
Terrifying.
Yeah, it's, I just got married as well, and my wife was partly also very amused by all the wigs. She's like, this really is real. They wear wigs and stuff, So, in that sense, I didn't know what the hell was going on. But then the temperature went up another notch when they arrested him just before we went in to have this final kind of appeals hearing. And they faxed his testimony from the police cell, which is really quite unheard of. If you want to arrest someone and have a proper case, you don't start faxing that stuff to other people. Like, this is what he said, 20 pages of it.
Who are they sending it to?
Me.
To you?
They're sending it to me. And then they sent it to Channel 4 News and the BBC, and they briefed them that Hassan Butt had said whilst locked up after 9 days in a holding cell in Manchester, he said everything that he told me was a lie. Everything he told every other journalist was a lie. He'd never been involved in terrorism at all, and I had been a sucker. And he told me this stuff because I wanted to hear it, which was obviously really hard to hear.
Yeah,
because
what was going through your head when...
I lost my sight for about a couple of minutes. I just couldn't see anything because I didn't understand what was going on. I just wanted to cry and break down. And my solicitor at the time, Rona Friedman, said, look, it doesn't matter. You have to keep going with this. I was like, why? I don't understand. Like, I've lost all moral legitimacy. I'm protecting this guy, but this guy says not only am I a patsy, but there's nothing to protect anymore. He's a liar. He's a fantasist. He's self-declared. But like, I know that that's also not true, but then is he doing it just to get out of being in prison for 40 years, which makes sense. But then also, what else is going on? Because he did lie about stuff. And I was like, I knew that was a lie. And the police were like, actually, on this day, when he said he was here, right? And I was like, oh, right, he is a liar. So she said, you have to keep going, because if you don't keep going, the law will be written in this way. So there's, and that will go against you. You can't just quit. And look, all these people are paying to make sure that this happens and supporting you. You can't just back out. And I was like, I don't want to do this. I really don't want to do it. But I just went into court, like in this bemused state. What I didn't know was that they'd sent the facts to Channel 4 News as well. And so when I got out of court that day, Simon Israel, who I don't personally hold in any way responsible for this, but he was just doing his job, is there with a microphone saying, you're a patsy, aren't you? You've been shafted. And I'm like, I gave some pat answer about I can't speak because of legal issues, blah, blah, blah. And I like, as a journalist, you're like, oh, that answer, that's rubbish. Sure. I gave that answer. And I was like, I can use this now to not say anything because, again, I just want to cry and break down. And I don't, and how does he even know? So, yeah.
That must have been horrifying, especially as a journalist. You're always taught, don't become the news. But to have the kind of that happen and the police why do you think the police did kind of behave in that way?
He was wearing a really bad, ill-fitting suit as well. That was the worst thing. It didn't even look good, at all. It's just anyway, sorry.
But you were carrying on with the case, it sounds like not necessarily for your own specific case, but because you didn't want this dangerous case law for press freedom.
Yeah, it's partly that, and momentum will just carry you forth, right? But I went to visit him pretty much straight after.
In prison?
No, so he's out then at that point because he's being questioned in holding, and then they released him after he said everything's a lie. And that was for me, it's the conversation that turned everything. We walked around, he was very paranoid at that point, so he said, if you're going to come, I'm going to search you, and he spent about 7, 8, 10 minutes searching every single aspect of my boot and my clothes, make sure he wasn't being recorded. And I thought this would lead to some honesty, and of course it didn't. So I said, look, and that conversation got off to a terrible start. I thought I'd start with a very soft question, right? So I was back in journalist mode now, right? I'm like, I'm not your friend. I completely distrust you. I don't know why I was your ghostwriter. This has been a terrible, awful thing. I've been humiliated. Now I'm going to find out what the effing truth is about all of this stuff, right? And I said to him, look, how was it in a police cell? And he just went off on one. He's like, why are you asking me that? I don't know. I was like, oh my God, this is gone. This is a terrible start. You're already hostile. So we kind of worked through, and I was like, and he's had these moments where he's like, I just want to tell you everything. I don't know. And then he'd be like, I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what's true or what's not. And then he'd say, why are you asking me any of this? He's kind of bipolar in front of me. And I just walked away. That's the only thing to do to save myself. I was like, I can't trust anything you say now anyway. You're a self-confessed liar. Mm-hmm. And when he did, in fact, his best friend was put on trial for being a member of Al-Qaeda. I don't know why, but his best friend then did ask Hassan Butt to enter the witness box. And of course, the first question that the barrister said, Hassan Butt, you're a professional liar, aren't you? And he has to go, as he did, yes, I am. And of course, you don't want that person as your witness, do you?
Can't have many mates.
No, he has, this is the thing, it's slightly detached from the conversation about sources and such, but as a person and as a source as well, he has bouldered through many lives, wrecking them, putting people effectively behind bars, destroying, I think, partly my career for a couple of years. Many other journalists regret ever meeting him. And of course, there's the final disclosure, which is, as part of that trial that I mentioned, he then disclosed that he had a handler in the security services, which was, then the court went into camera. So normally these things are challenged, because obviously he's already said he's a liar. So if he says something like that, you go, oh, you're just lying again, aren't you? It wasn't handled that way. It was handled very differently. So you can, actually there's part of that trial in open court, which is still under a court order, which I can't obviously disclose to you without breaking that.
Why do you think a fantasist would have an MI5 handler?
Well, this is what I spent the next several years trying to figure out. And, no one, you can't ring them up and go, actually you can actually ring them up.
Anything.
No, I did, and they got very upset with the journalist who gave me their number. It's like, damn, just invite me for coffee. I want to be that, and it's just one time. But they're not going to tell you. It's their job not to. So, you have to do everything slowly through back channels, trying to find out through various contacts what had gone on. And basically it was this, which is, they ran him for a little while. Basically, I think before I had met him for several years, as someone who could deliver their message, hence the messenger. And that message was, terrorism is real, it looks like this person, and it's coming, and we should all be worried about that, because they weren't, it would seem, getting the resources or the public awareness that they needed to be able to fight this. So it's not per se malevolent, but it is devious.
And just very funny.
And then just to add, those things happened all the time in Ireland. So it's not peculiar that they should have happened, and those same tactics should have been re-employed in this country with this situation with Islamic terrorism, Islamism.
Final question before we'll throw to the audience. How did all of this kind of change how you work as a journalist? Did it?
Oh, I mean, that would take another talk. I think I had to change everything I did. I had to re-examine who I was. I knew I had those sort of basic skills. Like, I'd already reported from Afghanistan and Pakistan before. I'd gone off, I'd been, adventurous and persistent, and I'd got some great interviews. I'd effectively reported from 2 war zones at one point, and I got several scoops. So I knew I could do this kind of a thing, because, investigative journalism is its own clique, an annoying clique as well in many ways.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. If you're inside, it's nice, maybe. No one teaches you the very, very specific set of skills you need to do that. And it's quite different from daily reporting. And, people, and I certainly enjoyed that, but it's different. You think along different time frames, for example, just to use one example. But I had to re-examine everything that I did, because you get burned by a source very publicly and in this way. And, you realize you've screwed up. There's no way you're going to go back and say, I did nothing wrong, right? So fessing up to that, and also the cathartic nature of writing really makes you examine who you are. And I think I became a lot more psychologically aware of the dynamics between me and a source. But that was never the same again. And I think it meant that I could do those kinds of things, like do those, doing door knocks is awful. Like whatever the circumstances, but doing it when when the person who's died is a villain of the highest order, right, according to the rest of society, is really difficult. Tell me about your son who the world hates, right? How do you start that conversation? And I think this helped me forge some of those conversations and make them happen.